Hey everyone, welcome to the Orange and Black Insider. I am Anthony Cosenza, and we are very happy to have you with us once again, tuning in live, joining in after the live show, and listening to our program. We are very grateful to have you with us. I'm joined by my co-host, Scott Schulte. Scott, how are you doing? I know we had a little pregame discussion, a pre-show discussion about some fantasy football. Obviously, a lot of people are doing their drafts, so hopefully your draft ended up yielding, or your drafts, plural, if you have multiple drafts, ended up yielding some quality players.
I think so. I guess we'll find out here in, 16 weeks.
Yep.
But even if I lose, I still got to see an eclipse, so that was pretty cool.
That's right.
Unlike folks in California.
Well, I saw a little bit of it. I was kind of dumb. I was walking in and out of my day job, and I actually looked at it just straight on, which wasn't the brightest idea. I had a little bit of blurred vision for a minute or two, but it was still entertaining to watch. Thanks for everybody that's joining us live. We're going to try and get to some listener questions at the end of this program. This week, in terms of Bengal news, in terms of NFL news, this is going to be a jam-packed show. We've got a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. Obviously, the Bengals just came off of another preseason loss, albeit a decent-looking game by most accounts on Sunday against the Redskins. And then they've got their final preseason game coming up against the Colts, kind of a final tune-up before they play the Ravens in the Week 1 opener. But, Scott, we have to start the program with some frustrating and some bad news in Bengaldom or Bengals fandom. Vontaze Burfict was suspended, or at least it was publicly announced, was suspended shortly after the Redskins game. There's some talk that maybe the team knew, a few days before that. Regardless, word started spreading over the weekend that Vontaze Burfict was given a 5-game suspension by Roger Goodell in the NFL because of a hit that he put on a Chiefs running back that wasn't really involved in the play. However, technically, it is a legal play. Now, Burfict has appealed that suspension and now will miss 3 games. I want to get your overall thoughts, and then we'll kind of get into some of the more specifics and semantics that come with a 3-game suspension for Vontaze Burfict. I'm going to put a link in the chat, that in the live chat, as well as on cincyjungle.com, for people to reference in terms of how this appeal played out, the reasoning the NFL gave why they only dropped it to 3 games. And if you aren't watching us live, it's on the www.nflcommunications.com, and they have a link of a lot of press releases and whatnot, and that is on there, so you can check that out. But Scott, your initial thoughts and your initial reaction to Vontaze Burfict's.
I think, like most Bengals fans and most rational people, when you see the clip and then you see the 5-game fine or the 5-game suspension, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, because you look at, some pretty major things people have done, much worse than that, who have been suspended for much shorter period of time. And I think most Bengals fans would immediately go to the wild card game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, look at a lot of the stuff that transpired in that one, and look at how little, if any, suspensions or fines the Steelers got in that game, and you compare that to this, which you said was a legal hit. The report is supposedly the fullback he hit. And so we're not talking about 108-pound, wide receiver. We're talking about 240-pound, built like a brick house, fullback that he hit. So how defenseless is that? I don't know. But,
right.
The guy, apparently the guy who he hit said that they were cool. It was a legal hit and everything. I'm sure he got his bell rung, but it's are you finding a guy because he hits hard? It is football. It's, that's, I don't know. It's not tiddlywinks or, chess. So you expect the guys to hit hard, especially a middle linebacker, or I guess, or a weak side, a linebacker. You want him. That's what you want him to do, is hit hard. And, Ray Lewis, I can't imagine I'd find Ray Lewis or, Brian Urlacher or Michael Singletary every time they hit a guy hard. That just kind of gets absurd. And I think the biggest thing is you referenced that link to that. I hope people do get a chance to read that. It's not too long, and it does kind of have the NFL summary. For me, the most interesting thing was near the end of that article where it says, this incident is consistent with your pattern of egregious violations. And then they reference one incident from the 2015 season, one incident from the 2016 season. So the biggest thing Burfict plays, tackles 150 tackles a game, or not a game, a year. That'd be a hell of a game. 150. Yes, the guy's making 150 tackles a year, plus numerous other hits, where he's getting blocked in a play, where he's not getting to the ball before it's tackled, whatever. So multiple hits throughout the season. One a year apparently is a pattern of egregious behavior. One out of 200 or 300 to me doesn't seem like a pattern. I don't know. It just seems a bit extreme. And I think everyone who has grumbled and complained that it's because his name is Vontaze Burfict and he kind of has this reputation, I think is legit. I think it is it just seems like they're trying to make an example of him. And even cutting to 3 games, to 3 games seems extreme. I think some people are happy it's only 3, only because it's 5. It's kind of like you're going to give someone bad news. If the doctor knows you're going to die in 6 months, he says, hey, you're going to die in a month. Oh, guess what? You're not going to die in a month. You're going to die in 6 months. Okay, that sounds good. Well, it's still crappy.
Right, right.
The 3 games is still crappy. It's almost like the NFL wanted to soften the blow. Hey, we'll make it this absurd game 5 that makes no sense. And then we'll lower it to 3. So even though you're still frustrated about it, you aren't as pissed about how we single out your guy and how we seem to be kind of unfair and very arbitrary. And I know it's one, at least to me, this screams something that needs to be addressed in the next CBA. Because you hear a lot of the players complain about it. Almost every player seems to go into the league offices and go to arbitration. They appeal these because they're kind of willy-nilly, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. There's not any consistency. It's not clearly defined. It's something that needs to be addressed. In the meantime, guys like Burfict, who I'll say, he is not the cleanest player. He does some things sometimes that, okay, he oversteps the line. But that doesn't mean you should punish him every time he does something that's close. I mean, they need to decide, is this, if it's truly horribly, egregiously awful wrong, then yeah, go ahead and throw the book at him if that's what is in your rule book. But this play, isn't something that's egregiously, horribly wrong. You made a big hit. You've done bad stuff in the past. We're going to come after you, which I think is, at least to me, I think it upsets me the most.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he's lost a bit of the benefit of the doubt for these potential suspensions that come his way because of some past things that you mentioned and was in the ruling on the NFLcommunications.com page. The problem is anything borderline now with him is just it's subject and it's stuff that, like, this play, it was kind of unnecessary, I guess. I mean, preseason game. The guy wasn't catching the ball. He wasn't, he's running a route, but the ball was not intended for him. And the hit that he placed on the running back there was a hit that he led with the shoulder. He hit the guy in the shoulder. He didn't hit his helmet. It wasn't below, the knee area either, which has become, an area that the league is trying to crack down on to eliminate those torn knee ligaments and bad injuries there. So I wouldn't have nearly as big of a problem with him being suspended if it was on a play where you go, yeah, that's just, you're still not learning. That seems to be a play where he was tackling and doing something, at least in hitting a player. He hit them the correct way. It was just more, is that a defenseless guy? Unfortunately, any type of gray area with Vontaze Burfict from now on is going to be subject to league scrutiny. It's, I've seen some comments already in the chat room, Greg. It says, it's football, ! Matthew Lawless says National Flag Football League. And to be honest, it's going to be interesting to see what the league turns into and its viability. I mean, this is a big discussion over the next 5 to 10 years. I get it. You want to, the concussion thing's a big deal, and the aftermath and long-term health of players is a big deal. You don't want guys out there doing cheap shots, but you're also kind of making an example just for the sake of making an example, and it's not even a good one, right?
Yeah, and this sadly reminds me of a rule that me and you are both old enough to remember this. I don't know how many of our listeners, some probably are, some probably are not. Back in the I believe it was late 80s, early 90s, the NFL had this absurd rule called in the grasp.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And the idea was protect quarterbacks. And so as soon as a defensive player who was going to sack them, got anywhere, just barely touched the quarterback, they blew the flag, blew the whistle, play was dead, he was considered sacked. And that way you could eliminate some of the big hits, some of the, things that they weren't looking for concussions with this, the big nasty hits, guys getting hit pretty hard. And you look at guys like, Ben Roethlisberger, Cam Newton, some of those bigger guys that, don't really come down that easy. They'd be sacked like, 70, 80 times if you had that rule today, because, and it's almost like, well, are we going back to that? When they when they added that, I think it was the player safety, one of those competition committees, right? Let's try this. This will be a good thing. It'll decrease, big hits and injuries on the quarterbacks. And it just got to be a laughing stock where people, were constantly complaining about this and just the absurdity of, you get anywhere near a guy, you just touch him. How many times do we see that where the, quarterback gets away, or he sidesteps it, or he's able to throw the ball away, not take the sack. Well, in this old rule, it was a sack, you were down right there, and that was that. And it's, I hate to think we'd be going back to that with all the complaints and grumbling we had with it. It's just, it almost seems like we're going that direction, that we're going back to this kind of softer version of football that people are going to lose interest in.
Yep. And again, referencing, if you're live, I put the NFLcommunications.com link in the YouTube chat. It's also on Cincy Jungle where we stream live. So check it out. You'll find some interesting stuff in there. And one of the things, John Runyon, who is a former NFL player and was the guy who initially looked at the entire potential of a Burfict suspension, gave him 5 games. It's funny, and you mentioned this just a couple minutes ago, Scott, where he mentions the hit in the 2015 wildcard game on Antonio Brown. Well, in terms of him getting punished for this one on the Chiefs, I can remember a much more egregious hit by a Steelers player in that game, Ryan Shazier, who didn't even get flagged on the play, much less suspended the following year or the following playoff game, anything like that. So I find it kind of hypocritical, and unfortunately, it's that NFL's pattern, quote unquote, of behavior or pattern of, whatever they want to call it with Burfict. And now all of a sudden the Bengals have 2 starting defensive players and 2 of their better starting defensive players, and Burfict and Adam Jones set to miss week 1. If you remember, Adam Jones has been had a 1-game suspension for an off-field issue in January. So, all of a sudden the team is losing 2 quality players in the season opener. Just to touch on Burfict's side of the suspension, Scott, in those first 3 games, they're tough ones. It's their home opener against the Ravens. Then they quick week turnaround. They play the Texans. Then it's off to Green Bay in that high-flying Packers offense. How do you think, if at all, this affects the Bengals' chances of winning some or all of those games with him out of the lineup? You're muted, buddy.
Sorry. I noticed that as soon as I started talking, the little thing popped up on the screen saying, "Hey, you're muted." So anyway, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is, I think we've kind of gotten spoiled with Vontaze Burfict because it is just amazing how much the defense changes. Like the interception he had in the 3rd preseason game, where he knows the offense. It's just a very instinctive thing. He just knows where to be. I think it was a play a year ago, I think in the first week, where he intentionally went out of position for what the defense called because he knew where the ball was going, and he ended up breaking up or intercepting a ball. He just has this gut instinct. He knows, where the play's developing, how to cover guys. And he's, you don't see him until this year. I mean, this year's in great shape, but before this year, he never looked like this Adonis specimen, but he was a heck of a player. He was still very athletic. He knew what to do, how to do it. And that's something that, as good as these other linebackers are, that's just a very rare commodity. Someone that you watch and you're like, this guy always knows where to be. He's always, telling the air players where to be. He's always routing the ball, making big plays, in the run game, the pass game. I think that's the one thing that definitely they're going to lose. The one positive, I guess, if there's any, is that none of the teams we're really facing are great running teams. So you kind of have possibly that work in your favor. The Packers, yeah, I think it's probably Amon Green and Ryan Grant were the last time they were a serious running team. The Baltimore Ravens really haven't been a running team since Ray Rice went ballistic in the elevator. And then the one exception would be the Texans, who I know want to run the ball. Just had some trouble with that last year with Lamar Miller and with no quarterback other than Tom Savage starting. You have to wonder if they're going to be that successful in offense. So their games, you don't want to miss any games. The one positive you can take away is, as great as he is in stopping the run and covering the running backs, that 2 of the games you're not really going to see much of a running attack. And then the third game, you're starting Tom Savage or Deshaun Watson. So you're kind of hoping those are games you can at least get by and cover yourself defensively enough. So I guess I wouldn't be as worried as if we were going up against, like, say, the Patriots or the Steelers, where you really want someone like him, covering Le'Veon Bell in the run game and pass game, or some of those other teams. So I guess, it's frustrating, but I think it could be worse. Could be a lot worse.
Yeah. 2 things that just really stink about the situation, aside from a lot of people just not agreeing with Burfict suspension in general, just because of the massive gray area and the kind of the arbitrary process that Roger Goodell uses and his cronies use to suspend players. One, we don't know what's, anytime he makes a big hit, we don't know what's coming the following day or week. If, oh boy, Vontaze Burfict actually tackled the guy pretty hard. Is that going to warrant another suspension? The other thing that stinks, Vontaze Burfict missed 11 games in 2014, was suspended, with the PUP list, was off of out of the first 6 games in 2015, and then was suspended at the beginning of 2016 for the first 3 games as well. And then he did miss the final 2 there also. But, all of a sudden the star player, when he's on the field, he changes the defense, but getting him on the field is a big thing. And now the Bengals, have been talking about potentially getting him a contract extension. How do you, just to kind of put a bow on this topic, Scott, how do you rationalize the Bengals paying top money? I mean, when he's out there, he's a top 5 linebacker, I think. But you look at the last now 4 seasons, from 2014 to this season, he's not getting on the field, whether it's suspension or recovering from injuries or being injured. I still think you pay him a lucrative deal, but it's got to be incentive-laden based on playing time and statistics and accolades, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. He kind of wonders, because he hasn't played that much. It'd be interesting to see how much he would get on the open market, because this is a guy, like you said, he is a game changer. He is a defense changer. He's a guy who should have multiple first-team All-Pro selections. And I think he only has like 1 Pro Bowl, because he has the negative reputation and he's not always on the field. But when he's on the field, he's just amazing. I can't think of a linebacker on the Bengals in the last 20, 30 years, going back to James Francis, to Keo Spikes, who to me made me go, wow, this guy just, the way Vontaze Burfict does. But he doesn't have the same accolades. And so you wonder, well, on the open market, is there a chance the Bengals can get him signed without paying top dollar? And if they, whatever they do, I think they has to be something based on game pay. But I guess the one thing you'd say is, well, when he's suspended, I don't think he gets paid. So they're saving money that way. You could offer him, $10 million a year, and if he's suspended 8 games, well, okay, he got $5 million a year.
Yeah. We'll move on to something a little bit more positive, but the bottom line is Burfict will miss, after an appeal, he will miss the first 3 games of the season, which is unfortunate. He'll be joining Adam Jones in that first game as 2 suspended Bengals players. hopefully the rest of the team picks up the slack. Hopefully they don't miss too much of a beat. Some or all of those first 3 games are winnable games. The Green Bay one especially will be tough, but the Bengals could still get out of their 3-0. It's just a matter of other guys stepping up, making plays, and other areas performing a little bit better than we may be seeing so far in this preseason. If you're new to this show, again, you could join us live every episode on YouTube and on Cincy Jungle. And I just want to say also, there's a great breakdown on cincyjungle.com about the Vontaze Burfict appeal. So you can go check that out. It's got a lot of different videos, timelines, kind of chronicling the entire process and sequence that happened. So you can go check that out. But we are live on YouTube and cincyjungle.com every week. You can also get this podcast on iTunes, on SoundCloud, and as I mentioned, on YouTube after the fact. And then you can get in touch with us. If you have listener questions, obviously leave them in the YouTube chat, the comment section at cincyjungle.com, or you can email us, theobinsider@gmail.com, or get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. We appreciate your support. Moving on to something, I guess, a little bit more positive, even though it was a Bengals loss, Scott. The Bengals lost 23-17 to the Redskins, but there were some signs of improvement, I think, especially from the first team offense. They look sharp. Andy Dalton and AJ Green seem to be on just really in sync right now. Green's making some great catches. Dalton making some good throws. You saw your first taste of John Ross. He really only got one kind of a little end-around run. Joe Mixon still making plays, as we have come to expect almost every week of the preseason now. Unfortunately, one of the big plays of the game came from Burfict, a pick 6, and we know we're not going to see him. So even though they lost, how do you think the Bengals did against the Redskins? Who were some of the players that impressed you this week as we move on?
I'd say as far as the loss, it was a good loss, only because in especially preseason week 3, what you're really looking for is the first half, what happens with the first team guys out there. And they did really well. I thought they moved the ball pretty well. They did a good job defensively, good job offensively, especially the first quarter and a half when they were kind of more focused on we're running all the first teamers. We're kind of doing some of our stuff against a very solid Redskins team, the team that has some good offensive weapons, a very highly paid quarterback, great tight end, so forth. They held their own. I thought they did pretty well. I was pretty happy. AJ Green is still AJ Green. He made some great catches, and just it makes you kind of like I was saying earlier with Burfict. It makes you go wild. You're getting spoiled because this guy is just so good. The one thing I'll mention that I really liked was seeing the pass rush from the right-hand side. And the one frustrating thing was none of it came from our starter, I guess you can call him that. And it makes you wonder, I don't get why Michael Johnson's still a starter. I can see if you want him on the roster because he's a veteran presence or whatever. I don't get why this guy's starting games, because you look at the other guys who are, I guess, behind him, Chris Smith, Jordan Willis, and Carl Lawson, and they all looked very good doing it. It wasn't one of these things where they just kind of stand there, and the quarterback kind of gets chased to them. They were getting pressure. They were getting put, kind of what they've done the whole preseason. And in OTAs and in training camp, they'd gotten pressure. They've gotten past their guy. They looked good. And you watch them, you're thinking, this is as long as they're willing to put them in and hopefully give them all a roster spot. And, I'd love to see them all ahead of Michael Johnson. If they do that, that was a very impressive, something that we were missing big time last year. So even though we didn't get to see the offense play the whole game, and they did technically, lose the game, I'd say that was probably the biggest highlight for me was just seeing they moved the ball, that they did what they needed to do when the starters were in there, especially in the first quarter, and that you got the pass rush from the guys who I think most fans probably would argue should be your guys starting opposite Carlos Dunlap.
I will say this: I did see Michael Johnson, so I think the loss in play was one where he completely beat Trent Williams, who's an all-pro tackle, completely beat him off the edge and got to Cousins and forced an intentional grounding. So I don't know if it was a complete sack that way, but still a very impressive play. I did see Michael Johnson kick inside to tackle and pressure the quarterback from there, which was interesting. He made a nice play there. I think he was right next to Carlos Dunlap, actually. But you're right, still. I mean, Chris Smith, Jordan Willis, another week, another sack of the quarterback, more pressures. Chris Smith is – I think we're all pretty excited when the Bengals got Jordan Willis and excited when they got Carl Lawson just based on extensive college tape and what we knew about them coming into the draft. I personally didn't know much about Chris Smith. You know, I knew he kind of had some mediocre seasons with the Jaguars and was kind of a rotational backup. And he comes here and it's like, wow, who is this guy? He seems to be in on every play. It's awesome. What's good to see is it's not just always against second, third stringers. These guys are making plays against some of the bigger names and starting offensive linemen of other teams. So that's good to see. And I don't want to say they played great or even very good, but I thought the offensive line, Greg L says it in the YouTube chat, offensive line looked good. I don't know if I'd say good, but I'd say better. And I still think that this unit is playing a little bit above our low expectations at this point right now. They've kind of mixed and matched, put things together with duct tape and bubble gum and all kinds of different things. And somehow they're kind of getting it done. I think obviously as they start to play a bit more, they're going to get more comfortable with each other. Trey Hopkins has been, a very nice surprise in this camp. He's kind of seems to have usurped Andre Smith maybe for that right guard role, but we'll see there. Overall, I thought the offensive line was better. I do think sometimes a guy like Joe Mixon, if you go back and look at a couple of his runs, especially one where he kind of cut laterally about 2 or 3 times, making something out of nothing. Sometimes he makes them look a little bit better than what they're doing. But your thoughts on the offensive line this week, Scott?
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying. They looked better. They didn't. I think a lot of us in the offseason, you lose Whitworth, you lose Zeitler, Oboye and Fisher and Bodine have struggled in their careers, and you're just kind of thinking, oh my goodness, but the one thing I'm encouraged by is that they didn't look awful, and the Bengals seem to have catered their offense to that. Dalton still seems to be throwing a lot of quick passes. I don't know if that's also because it's preseason, but he has been throwing. It seems like a lot of his passes have been pretty quick before any pressure can get to him and blow him up. And the other thing that was kind of troubling was on a couple of the deep passes. I can't say they're the most accurate in the world. I kind of remember one. I can't remember if it was John Ross or who it was, where it just didn't seem like they were in sync. And,
yeah, I think it was Ross. Yeah.
And then the other time when they ran Ross on that sweep you mentioned, as soon as he got hit, I was like, oh crap, don't get hurt. It just seems to be so fragile.
Yeah, well, he popped right back up.
That was encouraging.
Yeah, he got about 7 or 8 yards out of it and popped right back up. And, I think that was about getting him used to the NFL speed and really showing some of the things they might do with him. He's probably a versatile guy, obviously very fast. And, maybe that's just what we might see from Ross this year. I do stand a little bit corrected. Mixon did have a fumble that was a little bit of a rookie mistake, and hopefully that's stuff that kind of cleans up, after this week. But still some impressive showing. And I'll say, Scott, there's another commenter in our YouTube chat that talked about Nick Vigil. He's been playing pretty well. And all of a sudden, some of these guys that they drafted both this year and maybe even last year are starting to kind of play more significant roles, and it's going to be hard to keep them on the bench, right?
Yeah, well, and it's just we talked about with Burfict. You were like, I don't know if you can't keep him on the bench the first 3 weeks, and he's supposed to be their speedy or more coverage guy anyway. So, which is one thing Burfict does really well is cover opposing players. So, yeah, and Lawson, obviously they have him lined up at linebacker. So it's very encouraging because with Burfict constantly getting suspended, you'd like to be able to see that depth and you like to see that you have the players you need, that you don't have to wait till cut down day and then go chase other players. So it's very reassuring to know that if Burfict goes, is out, if he misses any more time, if he has more concussions like he has in the past, if anyone else misses any time, you think you possibly have the depth of the guys you need in there. And that's kind of all you can ask for from your roster is we have the people we need. We don't have to trade for anyone. We don't have to be reaching for players. Now, we did trade a player away, which is kind of encouraging too, because he was a linebacker. So that tells you they're obviously very comfortable in the players they have on the roster in that position. Yeah,
and we'll get to some little news and notes in just a second here. Some minuses, I would say, on the week, Scott, and I want to hear yours too. I thought AJ McCarron still didn't play well. He's had a rough preseason. Apparently, he's looked not great in camp practices, and it's carried over to the games. Had a bad interception, and just is not doesn't look like the same confident guy that we've seen kind of rule the preseason. So and he's out there a lot of times with. And he's made some decent throws, but I mean, he's out there with Tyler Boyd. He's out there with Josh Malone, guys who can play and who will be on the final roster. It's not like he's out there with, guys that are only going to be cut. So, I was kind of disappointed in him. And one that we'll probably talk about in the next segment as well is Jake Elliott. I think a lot of people wanted to see him really assert himself and be the guy to be the kicker for the Bengals this year. While he has done well in preseason, he did miss one while Randy Bullock just keeps kicking just bombs. So those are a couple of my minuses. What about you?
I'd say I'd have to agree with those. At first I wanted to say the Mixon fumble, but the more I think about that, the more I'm not too sure, because it's not like he was hitting the ball, came out, he wasn't securing it. He just never had the ball. So it kind of makes you wonder, right. Was he, thinking he was going to do pass protection? Was he, lined up in the wrong spot? So you don't really, and you're not in the coaches meeting, so you don't really know what, or the, positional meetings, what exactly transpired there. But I think it'd be, it would have been worse if it was something where he had the ball and he just didn't have it secured and, he got hit and it fell, or something like that, where he, truly knows I have this. It just looked almost like a blown assignment.
Yeah.
Which obviously isn't good, but, and I kind of mentioned earlier, the Andy Dalton some of his deep, I can't say I saw too much as far as the deep passes that gave me a lot of confidence. Like they may not be doing too many of those if they are kind of worried about the offensive line. It would be just the fact that Michael Johnson still starting hard on that again. And the throw in is, and you hit on it, was with Jake Elliott. I mean, he's had a good preseason. If it was him and Nugent, like years past, and you look at everything he's done, he's made most of his kicks. He's had some great kickoffs. He's looks like a upgrade. He's the guy when you drafted him. The only thing that makes it kind of a battle is you have this journeyman who's bounced around 5 teams in 5 years, who all of a sudden thinks he's Justin Tucker and just can't miss anything. And I guess for my money, I think it's still got to be Elliott's job, only because you look at Bullock's track record, and he is who he is. He's been in 5 teams in 5 years. He's a career 80% field goal kicker. Has, in real NFL games, has not shown a lot of depth on his kicks. Hasn't had a 50-yard field goal in like 3 years. So I think as long as you think Jake Elliott can do that, if you think Jake can at least get 80% of his kicks, at least get, a 50-yarder, once every 2 or 3 years, I think you've got to go with him, because the upside on him is much higher. And yeah, it's great that Bullock is having this great little window, but if you look over a 5-year span and you're saying, okay, for a month, Bullock's great, I can't say that gives me enough confidence to think that all of a sudden he is a different player. It just seems like, he's been mediocre, subpar. There's one little blip. I would hate to think they're going to, make a roster decision based on that one little blip. last year he kicked for him. He made like 5 or 6. It's still the 80%.
Yeah, and go ahead.
I was saying, yeah. But I can't imagine that would be enough when Elliott hasn't done anything to lose the job and has so much more upside.
Yeah, and again, it was one miss. He's been doing very well in the preseason otherwise, and obviously the extra point facet is another one to consider if you're the Bengals. And what's kind of a shame is, I mean, if you are, I guess, what's a shame if you are rooting for Elliott to win the kicking job this year is, there were so many years where the Bengals had an incumbent veteran kicker that so many fans wanted to see truly challenged by a viable rookie, and he's gone now. And then they kind of have the same situation, and the veteran is kind of really, I mean, he's playing outstanding. So it's going to be, it's a difficult decision for them, and it's going to be, if they do end up cutting Randy Bullock, he didn't really do anything wrong. It's just more of who he's been, like you mentioned, Scott. And so that's something we'll be keeping an eye on next this game against the Colts, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. Just a couple little news and notes before we transition. The Bengals, in case you missed it, the Bengals have placed Cedric Pierman on injured reserve. They brought back Brandon Wilson, their safety defensive back hybrid kind of player that they drafted in the 6th round this year. They brought him off of the non-football injury list, so he is now playing and on the roster at this point. And so, obviously the Burfict stuff, and just kind of around the NFL, Joe Flacco, just because the Bengals will be suiting up against the Ravens in week 1. Joe Flacco has started finally throwing after having a herniated disc in his back, and John Harbaugh, is promising that Flacco will be out there starting week 1. We'll see. But just a couple news and notes going on around the Bengals and the NFL. Also, Joe Hayden signed a contract Wednesday with the Steelers after being released by the Browns. 3 years, $27 million. Pretty big chunk of money for a guy that struggled over the past couple of years, but had a great start to his career. We'll see if joining the Steelers kind of revives his career. And as a lot of you know, he and AJ Green have had quite a few battles, both in the NFL and at the college level. So that will continue twice a year, should Hayden and Green both remain healthy when they play. Real quick, we don't have to spend a ton of time on this one, Scott, but the Bengals do suit up against the Colts. So, it's preseason week 4. I don't want to always call it ugly, but it's you get a lot of backups in there. You get a lot of guys that are fringe roster guys. Just not normally the cleanest or most exciting play. But for the Bengals, there's a lot to sort out this week. And I think they have their minds made up at quite a few spots. But there's now, especially since they traded Marquise Flowers, as you mentioned, and Vontaze Burfict is suspended for the first 3 games. There's a lot to sort out at who they keep at linebacker. Maybe they go light initially. Maybe they keep a guy that normally would have been cut that's going to be on the field for the first 3 games, and then they get rid of him. We'll see. Defensive end, defensive tackle are log jams. Cornerback is a log jam. And now, as I mentioned with Cedric Pierman being on IR, there might be an opening if the Bengals decide to keep 4 running backs again on the roster. One is inclined to think that Trey Carson might have the upper hand if they do that, but whoever it is, they would need to probably show some form of special teams prowess, special teams ability that Pierman always showed them. So of some of those position groups, guys who may be on the roster bubble, Scott, who are some names that could end up sneaking onto the Bengals roster if they play well in week 4 against the Colts?
Well, I'm going to start by taking this a very, not a different direction, but maybe throw out some names that might be kind of odd. I know most people probably think like I think a couple guys who should be on the bubble are some of the guys we've had on the roster for a while that might be considered more locks. Guys like Michael Johnson, Wallace Gilbert, and Will Clark. And only because, as we kind of talked or hit on earlier, what we have at defense, obviously Carlos Dunlap's not going anywhere. He's signed under contract. He's a very good left defensive end. You have him, that's set. Well, on the other side, Jordan Willis has done very well. Chris Smith's come out of nowhere, made that trade look phenomenal. Maybe not as good as the Reggie Nelson trade we got from the Jags, but it's looking pretty close, at least based on preseason. And then you have Carl Lawson, who, even though they're labeling as a linebacker, is basically doing the same thing, rushing from that side. He's about the same size and shape as Wallace Gilbert, if I recall. Or, I'm sorry, Chris Smith is. So I think Chris Smith, you look at what they have over there, I think between Johnson, Gilbert, and Clark, one, if not two of them, could possibly be gone at some point. Probably, if not right away, probably once Jones and Burfict return. So I think that's going to be an interesting. And I don't know if it's really a battle because I don't know how much those guys would get in the fourth game just because they are veterans and they're not, the young guys you're trying to sort out. They're not the guys like Alonzo Russell and Alex Erickson and, Carson and, some of those folks that you are really looking to see. I think one guy who probably benefits quite a bit from the Burfict injury or suspension is someone like Jordan Evans, who's apparently had a pretty solid rookie campaign, but you just don't really know what you're going to get with him. And, some of the knocks on him was he was very athletic, seemed to always be in the right spot, but wasn't much of a hitter. Was a guy who tended to get there, and then he would just stand there and wait for the running back or whoever to initiate contact instead of really getting to them. But he did seem to have all the right traits and, seemed to know what he was doing. So he's someone who obviously could benefit. And then you look at someone like Paul Dawson, who has kind of gone, all over the place with the Bengals fans' expectations of him and the team's expectations that this guy's our future starter, him and Burfict. We are set at linebacker to the guy's cut and no one wants to pick him up when he was on our practice squad. So kind of makes you wonder, is this, his third last hurrah with the team? And then it kind of also is interesting, you look at some of the defensive backs, the guys like the Duron Smith and John Shaw and Clayton Fedulum and even Brandon Wilson. Brandon Wilson, I think most people expected he was probably drafted as a special teams guy, kind of like James Wright was, who just happened to play a position. So out of one, I guess my thoughts are over the place because not only do you have the 53 that you need to pick, but you get like that little extra leeway because you do have guys like Pierman on IR. You do have guys suspended like Adam Jones and Vontaze Burfict. So you kind of get 56 or 57 when it's all said and done that you kind of get to pick from. And so for me, on the defense, it just seems like there's so many options there.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Who the Bengals have out there, those first, that first game, those first 3 weeks, you might not see them the rest of the year. They might be gone once these guys come off the suspension. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, that whoever they have as the 53 going into week 1 may not be the same 53, in week 2 or week 4 necessarily. So, but yeah, I'm really excited about seeing Brandon Wilson. I hear a lot of good things about him. He's a guy who can kick return. He's a guy who played corner and safety at Houston. Obviously, special teams guy on coverage. Probably going to do, he's probably the defensive version of Cedric Pierman. When they made kind of that swap out there, that's kind of probably what we're going to see. We just talked about it. I don't want to go into big length, but the kicking situation, that's got to get figured out. And that's probably one of the only positions where the Bengals are going, maybe they may have made their mind up, but maybe they really need to see something in this last game from both of these guys to really tip the scale one way or the other. And the pressure's on both those guys to really make all the opportunities that they were given, and they've pretty much been alternating most of the time throughout the preseason. So they may not be that many. We'll see. I don't. You kind of mentioned defensive line. I'm really intrigued by Will Clark and what's going to happen with him. The Bengals have kind of made an experiment with him where they are going to play him inside a little bit more, and then he's on the outside. But then you've got guys, as we mentioned, Lawson, Willis, Smith, that are rushing off the edge like crazy, and all of a sudden Clark is kind of getting passed up in the shuffle there. Former third-round pick, you'd hate to see him, like another former third-round pick, P.J. Dawson, end up not really realizing for the team. I mean, that's pretty high draft collateral that you invest in guys like that. So going to be interested there. And then, I'm just curious to see, I think, in general, what the Bengals are going to do at defensive tackle. I saw some folks in our live chat talking about Deshaun Williams. He's a guy I like. They've got David Dean, an undrafted guy that the team really likes, that they grabbed last draft. And then, like I said, there's kind of a hybrid guy like Clark. There's Marcus Hardison still floating around there. There's, obviously you kind of got your starters, maybe Billings and Atkins, or Sims and Atkins. And it's gonna be interesting to see how the Bengals kind of shuffle all of that out, and it's going to be interesting to see where they go light and where they go deep. One question I want to ask of you: you mentioned his name. In order to keep him, they would need to go 7 wide receivers at the position group. He's played well this preseason once again. Really didn't contribute much to the regular season last year, except for on kickoff returns. Is Alex Erickson safe? I mean, do they keep 7, in your opinion? Do they keep 7 wide receivers and Erickson makes it?
I think it's a good question. What they did in the draft, you almost kind of get the impression they went into this year thinking he was not safe, thinking that he was someone who was only a special teams guy, was not a receiver, and someone they were going to look at replacing. And some of the guys they grabbed, the Mixon, Ross, Brandon Wilson, so forth. Also, you have Adam Jones. You have guys who can do what he did, which was return punts, return kicks. Maybe not as well, maybe better, but they serve a similar role. And it's almost like they went into this draft thinking, here's a guy who is one-dimensional. He's only a return guy. And granted, return guys who can only return aren't that bad. Mel Gray was pretty good. Josh Cribbs, there have been some others, Devin Hester. So if you have a guy who can only return, but they're pretty good, that's nothing to, dismiss. But if he's, Brandon Tate, we're like, or Quan Cosby, we were like, yeah, he's very replaceable. And I kind of makes you wonder, did the Bengals feel that way? And that's why they went after so many guys who could also return. That being said, if that was their plan, he seems to have done a good enough job to say, hey, I am your return guy, and I'm developing as a pass catcher. And then if you, and it kind of brings up a good question, because then you said, well, would you keep 7? Because if you look at the 6, I can't imagine them cutting any of the 6. You're obviously not going to cut Ross. They're not going to cut Green, Boyd, or LaFell. They're probably not cutting Cody Core or Josh Malone, guys who they just drafted, so they obviously want to see. And so then you've got to carry 7 of them. And I'd say especially with I kind of alluded to the suspensions and some of the injuries earlier, there's a chance that he's a guy who might make the roster initially, but maybe only to give a few more weeks just to see what happens. Although since most of the injuries or suspensions are on the defensive side, you would kind of think, well, they would probably go heavy on the defensive side, with the idea being that in a couple weeks when Jones and Burfict are back, their replacements are the ones who get let go. So I think right now I'm thinking I have to say it's probably 50-50, probably leaning towards him staying, only because the team seems to like him and he seems to be doing more than returning this year. And the guys who are supposed to replace him as returners really haven't stepped up and made you say, wow, forget about Erickson. We have this guy.
I agree with you. And fortunately for some, unfortunately for others, the Bengals haven't extensively tried Joe Mixon and John Ross as return men. They were very exciting at it in college, and they just haven't done much of it in the preseason here. So we'll see if the Bengals end up maybe using them sparsely. I think Erickson's played his way on the roster, and I think the team invested a lot at that position this year in terms of Ross and Malone. They like both of them. So I could see them keeping 7, just kind of Erickson's a specialist. Maybe that's why they go light at a place like running back, light at linebacker initially because of Burfict suspension. We'll see. But those are some of the areas we will be looking at and some of the position battles we will be looking at this week as the Bengals take on the Colts on Thursday night. Pre-game with this show. Listen to the podcast before you go watch some Bengals and have some maybe adult beverages, or if that's not your thing, maybe just watch the game and have some fun. But listen to the show beforehand if you get a chance. We appreciate it. Again, we're on iTunes, we're on SoundCloud, we're on YouTube. You can get all of our content there. We're on live YouTube and Cincy Jungle every week. So check us out live if you're able to every episode. We enjoy having you and we enjoy receiving your feedback and questions. And Scott, we've got a couple of quick questions before we get out of here from some folks who have joined us live. One of them was asking who we think will start week 1 at cornerback with Adam Jones out of the lineup. Will it be Darqueze Dennard or will it be William Jackson? What do you think? You're muted again, my friend.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You just need to sit here in my house and then you can hear everything I'm saying. Basically, so that's been all the audio problems all this past year. It's apparently I've been on mute.
Yeah, exactly.
The little snippets you can kind of discern from what the coaches are saying, from where the players are lining up, from the reps they're getting. I think it's got to be William Jackson. I know he's not the experienced veteran, but for as long as Dennard's been on the team, he's not really experienced veteran either. The consensus seems to be that Dennard is probably better suited for the slot. He's not someone like Drake Kirkpatrick who you're going to line up 1-on-1 against, the team's better receivers. Jackson seems to have that skill set and the physicality to do something like that. So I think if you're looking for your two or the two best, we're going to go 1-on-1, we're going to receivers. That's what Dennard, or that's what Kirkpatrick and Jones do. Well, if Jones is out, I think it's got to be Kirkpatrick and Jackson as your 2 starters, with Dennard slipping in when they use 3 defensive backs or 3 cornerbacks.
Yep, I'm in agreement with you, and I think this is a good week to, and you don't want to sacrifice William Jackson to potential injury or anything like that, but it is a good week against the Colts to get used to some speedy receivers. They have some good receivers: Dante Moncrief, T.Y. Hilton, Philip Dorsett, all these guys that can run. William Jackson, we know, can run. And so this is a good tune-up game for him if he is going to be. I mean, he'll get playing time regardless of what our opinion is right now. He'll get playing time if he's healthy, regardless against the Ravens. But as of now, I think he has the inside track on the starting job and might get tasked with a speedier guy like Mike Wallace against Baltimore. But we'll see. Obviously, that news will come out closer to the regular season opener. Another question we had, Scott, we kind of talked about some of the improvements we saw last week on the offensive line going into the regular season. Are you concerned about the overall improvement from Jake Fisher and Cedric Ogbuehi?
I guess I'd say somewhat, but not entirely. They seem to be better than they were last year. We are hoping for steps in the right direction. I think they are going that way. I don't think they're there yet, but they don't seem to be as awful as they were last year, especially Ogbuehi. Ogbuehi seems to, of the two, seems to be the one who's probably progressed a little more from where he was last year. I'm still not entirely sold on Fisher, and I would not be opposed to the team saying, hey, we're putting Trey Hopkins at right guard. We have Andre Smith here. Let's try him at right tackle, or someone else at right tackle. Probably Ogbuehi's position is the more important one, being the left tackle, and being that we had someone who was so good there for so long in Andrew Whitworth. So he's definitely not Andrew Whitworth yet, if he ever will be. But I don't think he's as big of a liability as he was last year. But Yeah, I can't say he's if he was the same guy he was last year, I think I'd be a lot more worried than I am right now. Not that I'm not, I'm can't say I'm not worried a little, but not to the level.
Yeah, and I've actually seen a little bit more progression from Fisher, but I think I agree with you in one sense that I guess I'm going to try and verbalize what I'm thinking here. It's a little difficult, but the amount of progression I've seen, Aboye has had farther to go in terms of progression and where he's playing and what we saw from him last year. He's got more progressing to do. So I guess I could see how one can think that he's shown more progression than Fisher in that respect. Hopefully that makes sense. It made sense in my head, I promise. But I've seen more out of Fisher this year that gives me a little bit more hope. But obviously, there are concerns there. They're going to go up against a Ravens defense that, regardless of age and who they've lost, who's not playing, they still always seem to know how to get to the passer. And, they mix up looks. They do the same thing the Steelers and the Patriots do. They mask their blitzes and who they bring. And, it's so these guys, they can't have their heads spinning in week one. I've seen some improvement, not enough to say, ready to go. I still have my worries, but I've seen some improvement. I think Scott has as well. Obviously, we want to see more. Scott, last one before we get out of here. This is kind of to me, it's not really we can't really know this quite yet, but I definitely think it's a possibility. Someone asks, could the Bengals pick up a final cut linebacker off of waivers? Obviously, it depends on who's out there, how many linebackers they keep, right?
Yeah, there's probably several keys we don't know to know the answer to that yet. But if you kind of look at who's, if you assume Burfict is not on the roster because he's suspended, you have Kevin Minter, Vinny Ray, Nick Vigil, Carl Lawson, probably Jordan Evans. So you have 5 guys there already. And then if you wanted to go with 6, keeping those 5 plus Burfict, okay, they could be putting a 6th in. He probably would not be a starter because they would probably start some version of Vigil, Ray, and Minter, some combination of those 2 or 3 with Lawson and pass rushing. But if they do, that basically says, okay, they're probably done with PJ Dawson. It depends on, have they seen enough from him to make him that guy as like their number 6 linebacker for, the first 3 weeks, or are they at the point where they're just going to say, yep, we just don't like what we've seen in him. He doesn't practice good enough. So we are moving on and adding a guy who we're probably only going to have on our roster for a few weeks, then cut. If it was something where they just had horrible linebackers, no depth, I guess I could see more of a chance of it happening, them going after someone who's maybe an established veteran and plugging in as a starter to replace Burfict. I think in this case, they have enough there that, and I think the trade they made kind of shows that they feel they probably have enough there that they'd probably be more inclined to keep one of their own, keep a guy there as a younger guy to develop in that spot, who they'd probably be looking at the practice squad once Burfict comes back, instead of signing a guy, unless there's a guy off waivers who they really love, like a Gavari Russell, someone like that, where they're like, we just love this guy. We missed him in the draft. Someone dropped him. We're going to add him. But like you said,
yeah.
If it's that, at this point, we really don't know.
Yeah, this is a year where I wouldn't be surprised if the Bengals grab someone off of waivers and maybe who their very first initial final roster setup looks like. Maybe it changes by a player. I wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if linebackers where it's going to be, just because they know they're going to get Burfict back, but it could be a guy that fills in for the time being. Nothing really would surprise me after final cutdown day. All of a sudden you see guys like Joe Hayden recently become available, and there's some weird things that happen. Some decent players, or players who used to be pretty good and maybe haven't played as well the last couple of years, that are eating up some money, could very well become available. And The other thing to kind of consider, the Bengals usually, I believe it's after week 2, the Bengals usually like to sign guys after a week or 2 in the season where they don't have to pay the entire guaranteed money of a contract. That's just the way they like to do it to a veteran. So, it might be even a little bit into the season, especially as maybe some injuries, unfortunately, come about. We'll see. Good question there. We're going to get out of here. I did want to acknowledge Plank Melody's question in the chat. Just asks, think the Bengals will go with more quick passes with questions on the offensive line? Absolutely. We've seen it already this preseason. The Bengals, that's been their offense. Now they've done a little bit more drop back stuff. You saw some deeper drops from Andy Dalton against the Redskins where he's hit AJ Green, but I think in general a lot of that stuff is get the ball out quick, especially as the offensive line gets their feet under them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some of the better defenses and some of the better defensive coaches might start catching on to that, and that's where routes could unfortunately be jumped and things like that. But let's hold our breath and see, wait and see on that, and hopefully that'll help Andy Dalton. And Andy Dalton is a rhythm passer. For those of, Scott, you've seen him. When he gets the shorter, accurate throws where he makes consecutive completions or a lot of completions in a row, especially early in a game, that's when he really starts to find a rhythm and gains confidence, right?
Yeah, that's the thing with Dalton is in this offense and with the offensive line, kind of how they're set up. I mean, they do have some guys that can go deep, but I don't think this is going to be the Bob Bratkowski, Carson Palmer, chuck it deep to Chad Johnson for 50 yards every play. It's going to be, short slant to Tyler Boyd, finding an open spot in the middle for Tyler Eifert. They have 2 guys now in Bernard and Mixon who can catch the ball in the backfield and little swing passes and dump offs. And they do like to get the ball to AJ Green on these little slants and screens and see if he can do something with it. So, and even Ross is someone I could see him doing something like a wide receiver screen or something, just let him, get him the ball in space and hopefully he can outrun the defense. And so I think they will go deep. I don't think it'll be as frequent, at least not early in the year. Maybe as the season develops, as Aboihi and some of those guys get a little better in pass protection, they get more confidence that Dalton's not going to get killed standing back there for 4 or 5 seconds. We could see more of that, but I think especially to start the year, it's probably going to be a lot of running plays and a lot of short, spread the field and get a lot of guys, within a lot of passes probably within 5-10 yards.
Yep. And totally agree with you in the early on sentiment, especially when you play, you play the Ravens, who, as I mentioned, know how to get to the quarterback, regardless of who they trot out there. They seem to always have guys that know how to get to the quarterback and know how to frustrate Andy Dalton. They also play the Houston Texans, who have an immense defense and can get to the passer too. So I think early on you'll see that. It also depends on the weekly matchups too. I mean, they could see things on film where, hey, this is a week where we can maybe do more 5-7 step drops instead of these 3 steps, get it out. So we'll see. But I think that's going to be a big part of the offense this year. And I don't think there's really anything to be ashamed of that. Especially if it produces, why not? They've got the weapons, so why not use them? Thanks for all the questions tonight, guys. Thanks for tuning in live to this program. That's going to do it for us at the Orange and Black Insider. Unless, Scott, you got any final thoughts before we're heading into the final stretch of the regular season, my friend?
Yeah, it's hard to believe it. I think probably next time we do this, we will be gearing up for week 1 already.
I know. That's exactly right. And well, I would assume at this time next week, we'll have a very good idea as to what the Bengals' final roster looks like. And, we'll talk about all of that. So join us next episode when we record live on YouTube or at cincyjungle.com. You can get in touch with us there. Or if you're unable to join us live, as I mentioned, you can get the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, or you can get in touch with the program if you have any questions, comments at the obinsider@gmail.com or Bengals at BengalsOBI on Twitter. You can get in touch with us. Thanks so much for listening. Let's hope the Bengals stay healthy in week 4, and we have some fun things to talk about next week. For Scott Schultze, I'm Anthony Cosenza. This has been the Orange and Black Insider. We'll talk to you next time.